broadcast outside of the Metropolitan Correctional Center. It is number 1,322 of Fahad Hashmi's detention. 812 of those days have been under special administrative measures. Under those measures, Fahad is not permitted to talk with other prisoners or guards or even out loud to himself. He is held in severe solitary confinement with no access to sunlight or fresh air. He is not permitted to read or hear the news unless it is 30 days old, and even then is subject to censorship. And he is permitted but one visit with one parent every 2 weeks. And even that currently has been suspended. So on this Martin Luther King Day, as we invoke the spirit and the legacy of Martin Luther King, we stand here to bear witness to Fahad's detention, to call attention to President Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder's complicity in the treatment of Fahad and others in similar situations, and to demand that Fahad's human and civil rights be respected.
Thank you so much for coming here tonight, for joining with us on this day that honors the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and for saying tonight to this city and to this nation that this is where we have to be tonight, that this is where civil rights violations are happening. And what we know about Martin Luther King was that he did not shirk from places, right, that were dangerous, that were unpopular, that were seen as not politically expedient. Many people today will be quoting the I Have a Dream speech in 1963 at the March on Washington. But I want us to sort of fast forward to 1967, when Martin Luther King came to a Riverside church on the Upper West Side, and he did something that I think we want to remember tonight, and I think we want to remind the Obama administration about tonight. Many of you saw President Obama last month get up in front of the world and say he stood on the shoulders of Dr. Martin Luther King. And we need to remind our president, and we need to remind our Attorney General, that if they are going to say they stand on the shoulders of Dr. Martin Luther King, that those are some awesome shoulders that carry a huge responsibility. Because when King came to Riverside Church in 1967, people had told him over and over, if you give this speech tonight, you will lose friends. If you give this speech, you will no longer have any access to the politicians that have helped you build this campaign. If you give this speech, people will speak out against you. And he got up at the pulpit at Riverside Church, and I'm going to read you just a few sentences from that speech, and he said, I believe it to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiance and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls the enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers. The world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. It demands that we admit that we have been wrong from the beginning of our adventure in Vietnam, that we have been detrimental to the life of the Vietnamese people. The situation is one in which we must be ready to turn sharply from our present ways. And Dr. King got up in that pulpit and he said that, and do you know what happened the next day? The New York Times came out against him. The Washington Post came out against him. He was never allowed to speak to the president again. And so what we must remember tonight and what we must tell the Obama administration is if you claim to stand on the shoulders of Dr. King, then what that requires is integrity. It requires courage. It requires doing things that your friends say that you should not do because there are fundamental rights at stake. We are standing here tonight in New York City, in the most powerful nation in the world, in front of a jail where a young man named Fahad Hashmi has been kept in solitary confinement for more than 2.5 years. And let us be clear, this is no longer just the fault of the Bush administration. Because on October 29th, Eric Holder re-signed the special administrative measures against Fahad. This is not just the Bush administration. This is the Obama administration. This is in the United States of America. He is a U.S. citizen. His family visits have now been cut off again for 3 months. This is America today, and so we need to remind President Obama and Attorney General Holder that if they claim to stand on the shoulders of Dr. Martin Luther King, then they better change their ways. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Theo Harris. Now, the role of journalists in various struggles for justice and against oppression has been historically an important role, but also a very precarious role. Working today in a climate that is dominated by a corporate-owned, profit-driven media, journalists are often restricted by their editors, by themselves, their own concern for their work and their careers, to limit the scope of their work. The lack of media coverage of Fahad's case is a testament to this. Fortunately, we do have journalists amongst us who have committed to a more ethical journalism, a journalism that is responsible and accountable to the lives of the people who are most affected by the stories they are reporting on. We are pleased to have with us Christopher Hedges here tonight, who I would count amongst these ranks. He recently wrote an article entitled "One Day or Soon We'll All Be Terrorists." It begins, "Syed Fahad Hashmi can tell you about the dark heart of America. He knows that our First Amendment rights have become a joke, that habeas corpus no longer exists, and that we torture. Not only in black sites such as those in Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan or at Guantanamo Bay, but also at the Federal Metropolitan Correctional Center, MCC, in Lower Manhattan. Hashmi is a U.S. citizen of Muslim descent, imprisoned on 2 counts of providing and conspiring to provide material support, and 2 counts of making and conspiring to make a contribution of goods or services to Al-Qaeda. As his case prepares for trial, his plight illustrates that the gravest threat we face is not from Islamic extremists, but from the codification of draconian procedures that deny Americans basic civil liberties and due process." Yes. Hashmi would be a better person to tell you this, but he is not allowed to speak. Please welcome into the studio Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges.
Thank you. On this day honoring Martin Luther King, who of course has been domesticated, turned into a red, white, and blue icon, frozen in 1963 with a speech that is grossly manipulated by the power structure, I want to remember another religious prophet from the same era, and that's Malcolm X. Yes. And if you listen to Dr. King in the last year of his life, you will hear literally the words of Malcolm X, who understood that, as King said, adopting Malcolm X's line, large numbers of American whites were what he called unconscious racists. And it is that vehicle of unconscious racism, which is always the flip side of nationalism, which is being used to strip us of our civil liberties. Because when we view American citizens of another color, another race, another ethnicity, another religion, as not fully American or fully human, then we walk away from what is left of our anemic democracy and allow the power structure to strip these citizens of their rights. And if you think that they're going to stop there, you know nothing about human history. I'm not the only person standing here on this watch list, and I can tell you that the next time there is a terrorist attack in this country, and there will be, I spent 7 years in the Middle East, and we are creating terrorists by the truckload, people who are enraged, who don't hate us for our values, but hate us because we're killing them. If once this happens, once there is a moment of insecurity, a moment of fear, they, of course, will not end with Hashmi. Hashmi becomes, because of this unconscious racism, the vehicle to strip the rest of us, those who stand up for our rights, those who are willing to carry out acts of dissent, from participating in our society. And this event tonight, that Gene and others have organized, is extremely important, because if we don't stand up now, there will come a day when it will not be possible to stand up anymore. Thank you.
So we've heard a little bit about how some of Dr. King's words are focused on, others are not, how he is often sort of fixed in a particular historical time that is maybe more comfortable, and we don't look at some of his later analysis that he offered. So we'd like to continue in that vein and hear a few more words from his 1967 Beyond Vietnam speech, which he gave right here in New York. And to hear those words, we'd like to welcome into the studio Tony Award-winning actor Bill Irwin, who has been an ally throughout these vigils, and we're pleased to have him back.
Just these words of Dr. King's on that same night in 1967. Over the last 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask? And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened. For such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which we live.
On April 4th, 2004, a young man was killed in Iraq. He became what would be one of thousands of U.S. soldiers killed in Iraq, and one of hundreds of thousands killed, including mostly Iraqi civilians. His mother became a fierce critic of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and has been a leader in the anti-war movement ever since. Please welcome into the studio anti-war activist and Nobel Peace Prize nominee Cindy Sheehan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Yes, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his Beyond Vietnam speech on April 4th, 1967. 37 years later, on that very same day, my son was killed. But we know the year after Martin Luther King Jr. gave that speech, he was assassinated on the very same day. April 4th, 2005, I was fortunate to be invited to speak at Riverside Church, a new Beyond Vietnam, building the beloved community. That was in 2005. This is 2010. This is 2010, and what we've built is just a police state. What we've built is more oppression. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. knew back in 1967 that this was a police state. He knew that the biggest purveyor of violence in the world was his own country. He knew that. What's changed? We're still the biggest purveyor of violence. The chickens are literally coming home to roost when U.S. citizens like Fahad and Lynn Stewart can be put in prison and George Bush and Dick Cheney aren't. So, I was just at Cheney's new house by the CIA on Saturday. The gates of Mordor. And every time I do something like this, people say, Cindy, are you stupid? Are you a moron? Don't you know that we have a new president? And I always want to go, really? When did that happen? Was I asleep? But how can people who literally don't break the law get put in jail for years or get tortured in Guantanamo or Bagram or other sites? And people like George Bush and Dick Cheney are roaming the streets free. And shame when we can be oppressed. We don't have a constitution anymore. I'm sorry. The USA Patriot Act, which Obama voted to reauthorize, Patriot Act, he signed extensions in 2009. The USA Patriot Act and our U.S. Constitution cannot simultaneously exist. It has to be one or the other. How can we live in our nation of laws when the elite have their own laws? So what we need is not elections. What we need is what my hero, Martin Luther King Jr. said, a revolution of values. We can't have one set of laws for them and one for us. One economy for them and one for us. One peace for them and one for us. No. We have to be our own peace, our own economy, our own laws. Let's free Fahad, but let's free Mumia. Let's free Lawrence Peltier. And then we have a new president. What's happened? Nothing, except things have gotten worse. So I was in front of the CIA on Saturday protesting the drone bombings in Pakistan. I don't like drone bombings anywhere. But the CIA goes into Pakistan as a paramilitary, extra-legal, extrajudicial organ of violence. And people have emailed me. I don't think I've ever gotten so much hate mail since 2005 when I camped in front of George Bush's ranch. And they say, Cindy, don't you know that this program saves American lives? And I say, nothing's going to change in this country till you care about the babies that are being killed by these drones, by these Americans who are sitting in bunkers. Nothing's going to change until we get away from this exceptionalism that says that our lives are more important than their lives, that our security is more important than their security, that our economy is more important than theirs, that we all have the same existential right to exist, to have the same human rights. So we had a moment of silence. Now I want to have a moment of rowdiness, and I want you to turn around and yell, "Free Fahad," as loud as we can. That's "Free Fahad! Free Fahad! Free Fahad! Free Fahad! Free Fahad! Free Fahad! Free Fahad!
This has been Radio Free Fahad. Thank you for coming out. ThawAction.org, EducatorsForCivilLiberties.org, and FreeFahad.com.
Even in my own life, since my son was killed and I become an anti-war protester and standing up for justice, standing up for civil rights, I've seen the USA Patriot Act at work. I've been arrested like somewhere around 13 or 14 times at this point, and it seems to me that the laws change. They're arbitrarily administered, they're arbitrarily enforced, and if I get arrested like one day in Washington, D.C. for something, the penalty is one thing. If I get arrested a month later, it's different. So I think that the Patriot Act, of course, was designed to undermine especially the Bill of Rights. You know, our right to free speech, our right to freedom of expression, our right to peaceably assemble, our right to petition our government, our right to know what we're being charged with, to a speedy trial. The Patriot Act was designed to undermine those things, and the fear-mongering was used to get the people of America to support it. In March, I'm moving to Washington, D.C. I'm setting up a camp called Camp Out Now. And as activists to Free Fahad are welcome to come and join us in our direct actions to take back this country.